Welcome to today's Explainer. We are cracking open a 2,000-year-old Buddhist text today, specifically the Sarvastivada Vinaya. And what we're going to find inside is a shockingly sophisticated system of jurisprudence and human psychology. We're going to be taking a modern perspective on the four Parajikas. These are the most severe monastic rules that resulted in absolute expulsion. Specifically, we'll be doing a deep dive into the incredibly nuanced criteria the ancient world used for judging the crimes of killing and false speech. Now, you might think ancient religious texts are just, rigid lists of moral do's and don'ts. But as we're about to see, they actually read a lot more like modern Supreme Court rulings dealing with incredibly complex human psychology. All right, let's quickly run through our legal brief for today. 1. A dangerous psychological crisis. 2. The modern jurisprudence of killing. 3. Famine and faith fraud. 4. False speech and its exemptions. And 5. How motive determines absolutely everything. Let's get into it. But before we get to the heavy legal theory, I want you to consider this bizarre but historically very real question. If a monk accidentally causes a death while running for his life from a tiger, or maybe fleeing from bandits, is he guilty of murder? Just hold that thought for a second, because the answer totally challenges everything we might assume about what a serene, contemplative, monastic text actually cares about. Section 1. A dangerous psychological crisis, the unexpected consequences of meditation. Okay, to really understand the law, we first have to understand the crisis that triggered it. We're starting with a very dark, very real mental health crisis in the ancient world that practically forced Buddha to lay down his first major legal statute. So the text describes this time when monks were instructed to practice something called impurity contemplation. This was a meditation technique meant to detach them from their egos by visualizing the decay of the physical body. Imagine focusing entirely on corpses, bones, the really grotesque aspects of human anatomy. Well, the psychological consequences were absolutely disastrous. The text notes that these monks developed a severe, profound psychological loathing for their own bodies. It spiraled into mass depression and even suicide attempts. Some sought out weapons, others took poison. And tragically, a group of up to 60 monks actually hired a Brahmin assassin named Megandika, offering him their robes and begging bowls in exchange for ending their lives. When the Buddha found out about this rapidly depleting monastic community, he didn't just offer some vague spiritual platitudes. He stepped in like a chief justice managing a massive public health crisis. His response was this decisive three-step intervention. First, he immediately halted that dangerous impurity contemplation practice. Second, to ground the monks psychologically, he replaced it with anapanasati, which is mindful breath meditation, a practice meant to bring peace without that awful self-aversion. And third, to ensure this never ever happened again, he established a strict legal precedent. This was the first Parajika, explicitly stating that intentionally taking a human life, or even encouraging someone to end their life, was grounds for immediate and permanent expulsion. Section 2. Modern jurisprudence of killing, translating ancient rules into modern law. Now, when we laid this ancient text side by side with our modern legal concepts, the similarities are honestly kind of mind-blowing. The text explicitly categorizes direct and indirect killing. Striking someone, using weapons, poisoning their food, which right off the bat aligns perfectly with what we'd call first-degree murder today. But it actually goes deeper than that. The text strictly outlaws praising death. This specifically targeted people manipulating vulnerable, sick, or depressed individuals into thinking death is somehow better than life. Today, we'd recognize this as the highly complex legal area of assisted suicide or manslaughter. They even categorized traps and hazards, digging concealed pit traps or setting mechanical snares. Depending on the intent, this mapped perfectly to modern reckless endangerment or premeditated murder. So the absolute crux of the matter here is the concept of criminal intent. In modern law, we call this mens rea, or the guilty mind. The ancient text is incredibly explicit. For the ultimate crime to be committed, there has to be a definitive mental desire to kill. In fact, the text uses this specific phrase, "let them die from this." If a monk digs a pit or uses poison with that exact thought in his head, boom, it's a Parajuga offense. But let's say a monk is doing repairs on a roof and accidentally drops a brick that tragically hits a carpenter below, resulting in death. The ruling is entirely different. Why? Because the intent was completely absent. The text actually provides some incredibly vivid, real-world case studies to prove this point. In one genuinely heartbreaking accident, a monk named Udian sat on a bed without checking it first and inadvertently crushed an infant that a mother had hidden beneath a blanket. In another case, a son rushed his elderly father through a really dangerous bandit-filled road at night, causing the poor father to die of exhaustion. And hey, answering our question from earlier, a monk, terrified and fleeing from bandits in the dark, fell off a cliff and landed squarely on a weaver, killing him. In every single one of these tragic cases, the Buddha ruled no offense for the crime of murder. Context and the utter lack of malice completely negated the crime. Section 3. Famine and Faith Fraud, Survival and White-Collar Monastic Crime. All right, let's shift gears from physical harm to the realm of deception. Driven by sheer physical survival during a devastating famine near the Vagumutta River, we see what is essentially an ancient form of spiritual white-collar fraud. This famine was so bad that even wealthy lay people barely had enough to feed their own families, let alone beggars. Well, some monks realized that these desperate, wealthy patrons would basically always prioritize feeding highly enlightened supernatural beings over regular starving people, so the monks hatched a conspiracy. They went into the village and systematically began falsely praising each other's spiritual attainments, creating this grand illusion of a deeply enlightened community just to secure food. When the Buddha discovered this scheme, mostly after noticing that these particular monks were looking well-fed and glowing, while the rest of the community was literally emaciated, his condemnation was absolute. He delivered this incredibly powerful ruling. A monk who falsely claims spiritual attainments for food is the greatest thief in the world. He essentially declared that exploiting the sincere faith of people for material gain was a worse form of theft than a bandit robbing a village with a sword. The text actually lists out the specific felonies of false speech that would get a monk immediately expelled. This included falsely claiming to be an arhat, which means fully enlightened, claiming to have reached deep jhana trance states, claiming to possess telepathy or the ability to converse with gods and demons, or even simply claiming a total freedom from worldly desires like lust and anger when it wasn't true. Lying about these high spiritual milestones just to gain donations, that was the ancient equivalent of committing massive financial fraud and embezzling funds today. Section 4. False speech and exemptions, the nuance of human error. Now here is where the ancient lawmakers brilliantly accounted for honest human mistakes. They created a legal loophole defined as overestimation. This is the act of honestly but mistakenly believing you've achieved a high spiritual state. So if a monk was meditating in total isolation and genuinely hallucinated a vision, or maybe misinterpreted a deep state of calm as full-blown enlightenment, and then told people about it, they were not guilty of the parajika of false speech. Why? Because the malicious intent to deceive was completely missing. Take the wildly fascinating case of the monk Subhadra. He publicly claimed that in a single moment, he could remember 500 kalpas. We're talking massive cosmic eons of universal history. Naturally, the other monks dragged him to the Buddha, demanding his expulsion for making such an outrageous, fraudulent claim. But the Buddha pardoned him. Wait, why? Because Subhadra had previously been born in a heavenly realm where time moved incredibly slowly. His past life memories were simply distorted by these massive heavenly timeframes. He wasn't lying on purpose, he was just genuinely confused by his own cosmic memory. The text constantly contrasts these two mental states. On one hand, you have the fraudulent intent of those starving monks conspiring to lie about their trance states, specifically to grift food from the villagers. That is absolutely a crime. But on the other hand, you have the famous monk Maudgalyana. He used his meditation to predict a massive rainstorm to end a drought. The whole village rejoiced, but the rain never came. The monks wanted to expel him for lying. But the Buddha ruled that Maudgalyana genuinely saw the rain coming in his vision. What he failed to see was an asura, like a supernatural titan, literally intercepting the rain clouds with his hands. The law punished the motive of the grifter, but fiercely protected the visions of the dedicated, albeit mistaken, meditator. Section 5. Motive determines everything. The ultimate judge is intent. If there is one core takeaway from this entire explainer, it's this. Whether we are looking at a tragic accident involving a hidden infant, a complex snare trap, a conspiracy to steal food during a famine, or even a bizarre magical claim about the weather, the 2,000-year-old law always interrogated the heart of the accused first. The physical action was secondary. The ultimate measure of the crime was the unseen intention, that mens rea, residing entirely within the human mind. It leaves us with a pretty profound thought to reflect upon, doesn't it? We so often view antiquity as primitive and our modern era as so enlightened. But when you examine the sheer psychological nuance required to judge a man not by the brick he dropped, but by the exact state of his mind when it fell, you really have to ask, are our modern laws and social judgments truly as finely tuned to human psychology and intention as these 2,000-year-old codes? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating text with me today. Keep asking questions and keep looking beyond the surface.